When Clayton Merrick's private luxury train stops in the middle of the Texas plains for a barefoot little girl standing on the tracks, it seems like a simple act of mercy. The oil baron brings her aboard, despite the grumbles of his wealthy passengers, thinking he'll deliver her safely to the next town. But as the train rolls deeper into the night, something shifts. The child speaks in riddles, knows things she shouldn't, and seems to see straight through the carefully constructed facades of everyone in that gilded rail car. Each passenger carries secrets they've buried deep, fortunes built on choices they'd rather forget. Now those secrets are surfacing one by one. What does this mysterious child want, and why does she seem to know Clay's darkest regret? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Iron Horse had been Clayton Merrick's pride for nearly 2 decades now, a custom-built luxury rail car that spoke of an era when men built empires with their bare hands and weren't ashamed to show what they'd earned. Clay sat in his favorite leather chair, the one positioned by the observation window, where he could watch the Texas landscape roll past like pages in a book he'd spent 62 years learning to read. The chair had molded to his frame over the years, worn smooth in places where his hands naturally rested, a comfortable companion for a man who'd spent most of his life working too hard to notice comfort. Outside, the late autumn sun was settling toward the horizon, painting the plains in shades of amber and rust. It reminded Clay of his father's old ranch, back when the Merrick name meant honest work and calloused hands rather than oil derricks and board meetings. He pulled out his silver pocket watch, the one piece of that earlier life he'd kept close. The engraving on the back had worn smooth under his thumb over the decades. Time is the only thing you can't buy back. Use it wisely. His father had given it to him the day Clay left for Houston, determined to make something more of himself than a third-generation cattle rancher. Well, he'd made something more, hadn't he? The watch showed 7:30. They'd left Houston 3 hours ago, right on schedule, bound for Santa Fe, where Clay had business interests that needed personal attention. The kind of attention you couldn't delegate, even after 35 years of building an empire that stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Permian Basin. More brandy, Mr. Merrick. Jenkins appeared at his elbow, the silver tray balanced with the easy grace of a man who'd been serving on this train for 20 years. The conductor was old school, the kind of employee who took pride in anticipation, in knowing what was needed before being asked. No, thank you, Jenkins. I'm fine for now. Clay gestured toward the dining car. How are our guests settling in? Quite comfortably, sir. Mrs. Holloway requested the salmon. Dr. Cross is reviewing some medical journals. The Ashfords are enjoying the wine selection, and Mr. Berkeley has been on his phone for the better part of an hour. Jenkins allowed himself a slight smile. Business never sleeps, as they say. Clay nodded, recognizing the truth in that. He'd invited this particular group for reasons both social and strategic. Margaret Holloway dealt in fine art, and Clay had been considering expanding his collection. She had an eye for value, everyone said, could spot a masterpiece where others saw only paint and canvas. At 58, she carried herself with the kind of refined elegance that came from decades in high society. Dr. Raymond Cross was newer to Clay's circle, introduced through mutual business acquaintances. The surgeon had built quite a reputation in Houston, the kind of doctor wealthy families called when they needed discretion along with skill. Clay had been considering him for the board of a medical investment group. The Ashfords, Vivian and Charles, were old money, the kind of couple who appeared in society pages and charity galas with practiced smiles. Charles had inherited his family's banking fortune and managed to not squander it, which Clay considered an achievement in itself. Vivian was gracious, well-spoken, the perfect complement to her husband's more gregarious nature. And then there was Thomas Berkeley, investment banker, ruthlessly efficient, with eyes that calculated value in everything they saw. Clay had done business with him before, always walked away, feeling like he'd won the negotiation, but suspecting Thomas had somehow won more. The man was 57, but had the drive of someone half that age, always pushing, always acquiring. They were Clay's kind of people, in a way. Success stories, self-made or well-maintained, the kind who understood that the world rewarded those who were willing to make difficult choices. The kind who didn't apologize for their wealth. The dining car glowed with warm light, crystal and silver catching the last rays of the sunset. Mahogany panels lined the walls, polished to a mirror shine. The Iron Horse wasn't just transportation, it was a statement, a rolling testament to what a man could build if he refused to accept limitations. Clay's father would have called it excessive. Clay called it He watched his reflection in the window, superimposed over the darkening plains. 62 years looked back at him, the lines around his eyes deeper than they'd been even 5 years ago. His hair had gone silver at the temples, distinguished rather than old. At least that's what people told him. He'd kept himself fit, still rode horses on his ranch outside Austin, still worked a full day without needing an afternoon nap like some men his age. But the reflection also showed something else, something he didn't often let himself acknowledge. There was a loneliness there, settled deep in the set of his jaw, the way his shoulders carried tension even when he was supposed to be relaxing. His marriage had ended 8 years ago, not dramatically, but like a slow leak in a tire, the air just gradually escaping, until one day you realized you were riding on the rim. Sarah had wanted something he couldn't give, some version of himself that existed before the oil strikes, before the money, before success became the only language he spoke fluently. Their daughter, Rebecca, had sided with her mother, not loudly, not with accusations, but with silence that cut deeper than any argument. She was 34 now, living in Colorado, married to a teacher of all things, raising Clay's grandchildren in a modest house he'd never been invited to visit. He sent checks on birthdays and holidays, large ones, and received polite thank-you notes that read like business correspondence. The pocket watch felt heavy in his hand. "Sir?" Jenkins had returned, and something in his tone made Clay look up sharply. "We're approaching the canyon section. Weather Service reported some unusual atmospheric conditions earlier. Nothing serious, but the engineers wanted you informed." "Unusual how?" "Temperature fluctuations, some electrical disturbances, could affect the lights briefly." Jenkins maintained his professional composure, but Clay had known him long enough to sense unease. "Perfectly safe, of course. The Iron Horse has weathered far worse." Clay nodded. "Keep me posted if anything develops." As Jenkins departed, Clay rose and made his way toward the dining car. It was time to be social, to play the gracious host. That was part of the game too, the careful cultivation of relationships that might prove useful down the line. His father would have called it cynical, Clay called it practical. The dining car hummed with quiet conversation and the gentle clinking of silverware on china. Margaret Holloway sat near the window, her salmon barely touched, attention focused on a leather-bound catalogue in her lap. She looked up as Clay approached, offering a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Clayton, this is exquisite." She gestured at the rail car's interior. "The woodwork alone must be worth a fortune. My grandfather was a carpenter before he was a rancher. I like to think he'd appreciate the craftsmanship." Clay settled into the seat across from her. "Found anything interesting in that catalogue?" "Always." Margaret closed it carefully, protective. "There's an estate sale next month in Boston. Some remarkable pieces coming to market, European masters mostly. The kind of art that appreciates not just in value, but in cultural significance." Clay had learned to read the subtext in conversations like this. She was gauging his interest, testing whether he was serious about collecting or just another rich man looking for something to hang on his walls. "I've been thinking it's time to invest in beauty, not just commodities. Oil and gas have been good to me, but they don't feed the soul." Something flickered across Margaret's face, gone too quickly to identify. "No, they don't. Though I've found that beauty comes with its own complications. Authenticity, provenance, The stories behind the art. Sometimes those stories are harder to verify than we'd like. Before Clay could respond, Dr. Raymond Cross joined them, medical journal tucked under his arm. He had the careful posture of a man who spent long hours on his feet, every movement economical and purposeful. Evening, Clayton, Margaret, magnificent sunset we're having. Raymond, enjoying the journey so far? Very much, though I confess I'm always slightly on edge when I'm away from the hospital. Occupational hazard. He smiled, but it was tight, controlled. You never know when you might be needed. Surely you have colleagues covering your cases. Margaret's question was polite, conversational. Of course, but responsibility doesn't delegate as easily as tasks. Raymond's hand moved to his water glass, gripped it perhaps a bit too firmly. Some things stay with you whether you're present or not. The Ashfords approached then, Charles's laugh preceding them like an announcement. He was the kind of man who filled a room naturally, not through volume but through sheer presence. Vivian followed a half-step behind, elegant in a way that suggested careful cultivation rather than natural ease. She wore pearls that caught the light, real ones, the kind passed down through generations rather than purchased. Claire, this wine selection is remarkable. I was just telling Vivian, you've outdone yourself with the hospitality. Charles clapped Clay on the shoulder with easy familiarity. They'd known each other for 15 years, done business together, sat on the same boards. Though I have to say, roughing it on a luxury train seems like a contradiction in terms. Some contradictions are worth embracing, Clay replied, catching the way Vivian's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. There was history there, between the Ashfords, the kind that long marriages either healed or learned to work around. He'd seen it before in couples who stayed together more from habit than happiness. Mr. Merrick. Thomas Berkeley approached, phone finally absent from his hand, though Clay suspected it was burning a hole in his pocket. Thomas had the lean, hungry look of a man who'd learned early that the world rewarded aggression. I've been reviewing the prospectus you sent. The New Mexico operation has interesting potential. That's what I hoped you'd think. We can discuss details tomorrow when we're fresh. Clay had learned that the best deals happened when people weren't trying to make deals, when guards were down and honest opinions slipped through careful professional veneers. Of course. Thomas glanced around the dining car, assessing, always assessing. You've built something impressive here, Clayton. Not just the train, but the whole empire. It takes a particular kind of vision to see opportunities where others see only obstacles, or a particular kind of blindness to consequences. Margaret murmured, then looked startled as if the words had escaped without permission. I apologize. That was uncalled for. An awkward silence settled over the group. Clay studied Margaret more carefully. There was something fragile in her posture tonight, something beneath the cultivated sophistication. Dr. Cross shifted uncomfortably, and even Charles's perpetual good humor seemed to dim. We all make choices, Clay said finally, keeping his tone neutral. Build what we can with the materials at hand. Some of us are just more honest about the cost. Are we? Vivian spoke so quietly that everyone turned to look at her. She met their gazes steadily, then offered a small smile. I only mean that sometimes we convince ourselves we're being honest when we're really just being comfortable with our own rationalizations. Charles reached for his wife's hand, an instinctive gesture that spoke of long practice. Darling, perhaps we're getting too philosophical for a dinner conversation. Perhaps, but Vivian didn't look away from Clay, though I've always thought that's when the most interesting conversations happen, when we stop pretending everything is simple. Jenkins appeared in the doorway, his timing impeccable as always. Dinner will be served in 15 minutes. Chef has prepared something special for the evening. The group began to drift toward their assigned seats, the awkward moment passing but not quite forgotten. Clay remained standing, watching them settle in. These successful people with their expensive clothes and careful manners and shadows that clung to them like second skins. He wondered, not for the first time, if they saw their own reflections as clearly as they thought they did. The train swayed gently, as it took a curve. The motion so familiar, Clay barely registered it. He'd made this journey dozens of times, knew every mile of track, every landmark. The canyon section was coming up, where the land dropped away on both sides, and the train crossed on a bridge his company had helped fund 20 years ago. He'd stood on that bridge during construction, hard hat on his head, feeling like a king surveying his kingdom. Now he just felt tired. He returned to his seat as dinner was served, the conversation flowing around him in practiced social rhythms. Margaret discussed art movements with surprising passion. Raymond offered medical anecdotes carefully sanitized for dinner. Charles told stories that made people laugh, and Vivian added quiet observations that were sharper than her husband's jokes. Thomas talked numbers and projections with the enthusiasm of a man who saw beauty in balance sheets, and Clay played host, poured wine, asked questions, performed the role he'd perfected over decades. But part of his mind kept drifting to his father's watch, to Rebecca's polite distance, to choices made and paths not taken. The landscape outside had transformed into darkness now, the kind of deep black that only existed far from cities, where the land stretched empty for miles in every direction. Occasionally a distant light would flicker past, some ranch house or oil derrick standing lonely vigil, but mostly there was just the darkness and the reflection of the dining car floating in it like a bubble of light suspended in nothing. Claire found himself checking his watch more frequently as the evening wore on. It was a nervous habit, one his father had warned him about. A man who can't sit still with time is running from something, the old rancher had said. Clay had dismissed it then, as the philosophy of someone who'd never built anything significant. Now he wasn't so sure. The temperature in the car had dropped noticeably. Jenkins adjusted the heating, but the chill seemed to settle in despite his efforts. Margaret wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Dr. Cross frowned and checked his own watch, comparing it to the antique clock mounted on the wall. "Are we on schedule?" Thomas asked, the question directed at no one in particular, but carrying an edge of impatience. "Right on time," Clay assured him. "We'll reach the canyon crossing in about 20 minutes. Then it's smooth sailing through to the first stop." But even as he said it, something felt off. The air had grown heavy, oppressive in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The lights flickered once, briefly, and Jenkins appeared in the doorway with an expression that Clay had learned to recognize over 2 decades. Something was wrong. "Sir, if I might have a word." Clay excused himself and followed Jenkins to the corridor between cars. The conductor's face was professionally neutral, but tension showed in the set of his shoulders. "The engineers are reporting unusual readings ahead. The track sensors are picking up something on the line, but we can't get a clear identification. Could be debris from the weather disturbances earlier. Or an animal. They've reduced speed as a precaution." "How far ahead?" "Less than a mile. We should have visual confirmation shortly." Jenkins paused. "Sir, in 20 years on this train, I've never seen readings quite like this. The sensors are showing an obstruction, but the thermal imaging shows nothing. It's as if something is there that shouldn't be possible." Clay felt a prickle of unease run down his spine, but he kept his voice steady. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Sensors malfunction. We'll stop if we need to. Check it out. Clear the track if there's debris. Nothing we haven't handled before." "Of course, sir." But Jenkins didn't look convinced. They returned to the dining car, where the passengers were finishing their meal. The conversation had continued, but there was an undercurrent now, a shared awareness that something had shifted. Charles made another joke, but it fell flat. Margaret had set down her fork, food barely touched. Even Thomas had abandoned his phone to stare out into the darkness. Vivian was the first to speak what they were all feeling. "Is it just me, or has it gotten remarkably cold?" "Jenkins is adjusting the heating," Clay said. "Old trains sometimes have temperamental systems. This train is hardly old," Thomas observed. "You've maintained it meticulously." "I've seen the maintenance records." Before Clay could respond, the train began to slow, the change in momentum subtle but unmistakable. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and in that moment of dimness Clay could have sworn he saw something in the window reflection that wasn't there when the lights came back. A shadow, small and weighty. The train's brakes engaged with a long, low groan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth itself. Passengers gripped armrests, wine sloshed in glasses, and the gentle forward motion that had been constant for hours gradually, inexorably stopped. In the silence that followed, broken only by the settling sounds of the train and the distant whistle of wind across the plains, Clay felt his father's watch heavy in his pocket. Time is the only thing you can't buy back. He had a sudden, irrational certainty that something had just changed, something fundamental, and that whatever came next would not be managed with money or influence or any of the tools he'd spent a lifetime accumulating. Jenkins appeared again, his face pale, in the restored lighting. "Sir, you need to see this." Clown moved through the train corridor with Jenkins, their footsteps echoing against the polished wood. Behind them, he could hear the passengers stirring, concerned voices rising in pitch. Dr. Cross was asking technical questions about the brake system. Thomas was already on his phone, probably checking whether this delay would affect his schedule. Margaret's voice carried a tremor that spoke of deeper anxiety than a simple mechanical stop should warrant. The engineer's compartment smelled of oil and metal, decades of machinery humming in confined space. Jim Dawson, who'd been running trains for 40 years before Clay hired him, stood at the forward window with binoculars pressed to his eyes. He didn't turn when Clay entered. "Jim, what have we got?" "See for yourself, Mr. Merrick." The engineer handed over the binoculars, his weathered hand steady but his voice carrying an edge. Clay had never heard before. Dead center on the tracks, about 50 yards ahead. Clay raised the binoculars and adjusted the focus. The train's forward spotlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the rails stretching into the empty plains, and there, exactly where Jim had said, stood a small figure. A child. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow in the harsh lights. Her feet were bare, visible even from this distance, pale against the dark gravel of the rail bed. Long hair hung loose around her shoulders, moving slightly in the wind that swept across the plains. She stood perfectly still, not moving toward the train or away from it, just standing there as if she'd been waiting for them specifically. "How long has she been there?" Clay's voice came out rougher than he intended. "She wasn't there when we started braking. I was watching the track, Mr. Merrick. I swear it." 1 second the line was clear. The next second she was just standing there. Jim took off his cap, ran a hand through his gray hair. Thermal didn't pick her up until the spotlights hit her. It's like she appeared out of nowhere. Clay lowered the binoculars, his mind working through practical explanations. A child wandering alone out here made no sense. They were miles from the nearest town, crossing land that was either privately owned ranch territory or protected wilderness. No houses, no roads, no reason for anyone, especially a child, to be out here in the darkness. Could she have been hiding? Maybe playing on the tracks and froze when she saw us coming. Maybe. But Jim didn't sound convinced. "You want me to radio for local authorities? Could be a runaway. Or maybe there was an accident nearby we don't know about." Clay considered. The nearest sheriff's office was at least an hour away, and that was if they could even get through on the radio out here. Cell service was non-existent in this stretch. They could wait for help to arrive, keep the child at a safe distance until professionals could handle it. That would be the sensible thing, the careful thing. But there was something about the way she stood there, so small and alone in the vastness of the dark plains, that pulled at something in Clay he thought he'd left behind with his father's ranch. He thought of Rebecca at that age, all skinned knees and fierce independence, and how terrified she'd been the one time she'd gotten lost in the pasture for an hour. "I'm going out there." Clay handed the binoculars back to Jim. "Keep the lights on her. If anything seems wrong, if she runs or if anyone else appears, you sound that horn and I'm back here in seconds." Mr. Merrick, I don't think that's wise. We don't know anything about this situation, which is exactly why we need to check it out. Clay was already moving toward the door. She's a child, Jim, alone in the middle of nowhere. We can't just sit here. Jenkins was waiting at the exit, having anticipated Clay's decision with the prescience of long service. He had a heavy coat ready and a flashlight. Sir, perhaps I should accompany you. No need with the passengers. Keep them calm. I'll just be a moment. Clay took the coat and flashlight, then descended the steps into the night air. The cold hit him immediately, far more intense than it should have been for late autumn in this part of Texas. His breath came out in visible clouds, and the wind carried a bite that seemed to cut right through the heavy coat. The ground crunched under his boots as he walked along the rail bed, gravel shifting with each step. The girl hadn't moved. As Clay approached, he could make out more details in the harsh spotlight. Her dress was thin, cotton perhaps, completely inadequate for this cold. It was dirty, stained with mud or dust, the hem torn. Her feet were indeed bare, and Clay couldn't imagine how she was standing on the sharp gravel without crying out. But it was her face that stopped him 10 feet away. She was looking directly at him, and her eyes were old. That was the only word for it. The face was a child's, delicate and small, but the eyes looking out from it had seen things, known things, that no 8-year-old should ever know. Hello there. Clay kept his voice gentle, the tone he'd used with Rebecca when she was small and frightened. My name is Clayton. Are you hurt? Are you lost? The girl didn't respond immediately. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those ancient eyes, and Clay felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. In her right hand, clutched tight against her chest, was a torn red ribbon, the kind young girls wore in their hair. It was faded, stained, as if it had been buried in the earth for years. You promised you'd come back. Her voice was clear, despite the wind, and it carried across the distance between them with unnatural clarity. Each word distinct, measured, as if she'd been practicing them for a very long time. Clay felt his heart skip. I don't understand. Have we met before? Do I know your parents? You promised. She took a step forward, and Clay noticed that her feet didn't seem to register the sharp stones. No flinching, no careful placement, just smooth forward motion as if she were walking on carpet. But you didn't come back. None of you did. I think there's been some misunderstanding. I don't know you, sweetheart, but I want to help you. Are your parents nearby? Was there an accident? The girl looked past him, toward the train, and her expression shifted into something Clay couldn't quite read. Recognition, maybe. Or judgment. They're all here. Everyone who needs to be here. Behind him, Clay heard the train door open. Footsteps on gravel. He turned to see Margaret Holloway descending the steps, her shawl wrapped tight, her face pale but determined. Clayton, let me help. A child might be less frightened of a woman. Margaret's voice was steady, but Clay caught the tremor underneath. She'd seen the girl from the window, clearly, and something about her had compelled Margaret to come out, despite the cold and the strangeness of it all. Margaret, please go back inside. I have this under control. But Margaret was already moving past him, approaching the girl with her hands outstretched in a gesture of maternal comfort. Hello, darling. You must be so cold. Why don't you come with us? We have warm blankets and food, and we can help you find your families. The girl's gaze shifted to Margaret, and the art dealer stopped mid-step, as if she'd hit an invisible wall. The child's eyes seemed to look through her, into her, seeing things that were meant to stay hidden. The painting wasn't real. The girl's voice was matter-of-fact, a simple statement of truth. You knew it wasn't real, but you said it was. You made people believe a lie, and they paid for something that had no value. You built everything on that lie. Margaret's face drained of all color. She swayed slightly, and Clay moved to steady her, but she pushed him away, her eyes locked on the girl. What did you say? Who told you that? Who are you?" The girl didn't answer Margaret's question. She simply looked at her with those knowing eyes, then turned her attention back to Clay. The torn red ribbon fluttered in her grip, and in the harsh spotlight it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if the fabric held memories woven into its threads. "We should get her inside." Clay's voice was firm, meant to break the spell of whatever had just happened. "Margaret, go back to the train. Tell Jenkins to prepare a cabin and get some warm clothes." Margaret stood frozen for another moment, her breath coming in short gasps. Then she turned and stumbled back toward the train. Clay watched her go, concern warring with confusion. What had the girl said that could shake someone as composed as Margaret Holloway so completely? A painting that wasn't real. It meant nothing to Clay, but clearly it had struck a nerve. He turned back to the child. "Will you come with me? It's too cold out here, and you're not dressed for the weather. I promise no one will hurt you. We just want to help." For the first time, the girl moved voluntarily. She walked toward him with that same strange gliding motion, her bare feet making no sound on the gravel. As she drew closer, Clay noticed other details. Her hair was tangled with bits of dried grass, as if she'd been lying in a field. There were smudges on her face that could have been dirt or tears, dried long ago. The white dress hung on her thin frame, and up close he could see it as old-fashioned, the kind of garment that might have been worn decades ago. "What's your name?" Clay asked gently. "Emma." The word was barely a whisper, carried on the wind. "Emma, that's a beautiful name. I'm going to take you somewhere warm now, all right? We'll figure out how to get you home." Emma looked up at him, and for just a moment, something shifted in her expression. A flicker of sadness so profound that Clay felt it like a physical weight in his chest. "I am home. This is where it happened, where everything ended." Before Clay could ask what she meant, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were ice cold, so cold that he nearly pulled away instinctively. But there was something in her touch, a desperate need for connection, that made him hold on. He guided her back toward the train, acutely aware of how light she was, how fragile she seemed against the vast darkness of the plains. The passengers had gathered in the corridor, drawn by the commotion, their faces pressed against the windows, breath fogging the glass. As Clay helped Emma up the steps, Jenkins was there with a thick wool blanket. He wrapped it around the girl's shoulders, his weathered face creased with concern. "Let's get her to the guest cabin," Clay said, "and someone see if we have any children's clothes aboard. Anything will do." Dr. Cross pushed forward, his medical instincts overriding whatever shock the situation had created. "Let me examine her. She could be hypothermic or injured." Emma allowed herself to be led into the small guest cabin, a space normally reserved for unexpected additions to the passenger list. It was comfortable enough, with a small bed and its own heating vent. Jenkins turned the heat up as high as it would go, and gradually the chill began to ease from the small space. The passengers crowded the doorway, unable to look away. Thomas Berkeley stood with his arms crossed, his expression skeptical. "This doesn't make sense. Where did she come from? There's nothing out here for miles." "Perhaps she wandered from a ranch," Vivian suggested softly. "Got lost in the dark." "Barefoot? In this cold?" Charles shook his head. "Something's not right here." Dr. Cross knelt in front of Emma, his hands gentle as he checked her pulse, looked into her eyes with a small penlight. "Her vital signs are stable, but her body temperature is remarkably low. She should be showing signs of severe hypothermia, but she's not." He looked up at Clay, confusion evident. "It's as if the cold doesn't affect her the way it should." Emma sat quietly on the edge of the bed, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching everyone with those unnerving eyes. She still clutched the torn red ribbon, refusing to let it go even when Dr. Cross tried to gently examine her hands. Margaret had disappeared back to her own cabin, and Clay could hear her moving around through the thin walls, the sound of a bottle being opened, liquid being poured. She was drinking, and from the sound of it, not slowly, Emma, Dr. Cross said in his most professional, calming voice. Can you tell me where you live? Do you remember your address or your parents' names? The girl's gaze shifted to the doctor, and he visibly stiffened. Whatever she saw in him, whatever knowledge those eyes carried, it made a man who performed surgery on beating hearts look away first. You were so tired that day. Emma's voice was quiet, almost gentle. You'd been working for 18 hours. Your hands were shaking when you made the first incision, but you thought you could do it anyway. You thought you were good enough to overcome the fatigue. Dr. Cross stood abruptly, his face ashen. I don't know what kind of game this is, but it's not appropriate. This child needs proper evaluation, possibly psychiatric care. Rayrand. Clay's voice was firm. What is she talking about? Nothing. She's clearly disturbed, making up stories. But the doctor's hands were trembling, and he wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. I should return to my cabin. Call me if her condition changes. He pushed past the others in the doorway, his retreat more of a flight than a walk. Thomas Berkeley watched him go with narrowed eyes, then turned his attention back to Emma. All right, enough of this circus. The child is obviously troubled, possibly coached by someone. We need to contact authorities and let them handle it. Thomas pulled out his phone, then frowned at the screen. Still no signal out here. When do we reach the next station? Another 90 miles, Jenkins answered. Approximately 2 hours at our current speed. Once we resume travel, then let's resume. The sooner we can hand this situation off to proper authorities, the better. Thomas's tone brooked no argument, the voice of a man used to making decisions and having them followed. But Emma spoke again, and her words cut through the air like a knife through silk. Numbers can't fix what you broke. You've tried to calculate your way to absolution, adding up the money, the charitable donations, the anonymous gifts. But mathematics doesn't work on the human soul. You know that, don't you? You've always known. Thomas's face went from annoyance to rage in an instant. How dare you? I don't know who put you up to this, or what kind of scam you're running, but I won't stand here and be insulted by a child spouting nonsense. Is it nonsense? Vivian Ashford's voice was quiet, but it carried weight. She was looking at Thomas with an expression Clay couldn't quite read. She knew something about Margaret that shook her badly. She said something to Dr. Cross that made him run. Now she's saying something to you, and you're getting angry instead of defensive. That's interesting, don't you think? Vivian, please. Charles put a hand on his wife's arm. Let's not make this worse than it already is. But Vivian gently removed her husband's hand, her eyes still on Emma. The girl looked back at her, and something passed between them, some wordless communication that made Vivian catch her breath. She forgave you. Emma's words were directed at Charles now, and the older man went rigid. But you never forgave yourself. You think if you're charming enough, jovial enough, if you make everyone laugh and keep the mood light, maybe you can drown out the voice that reminds you what you did. But it's always there, isn't it? Even when Vivian smiles at you, you wonder if she's really forgiven you, or if she's just too tired to keep fighting. Charles's jovial mask cracked completely. His face crumpled, and he aged 10 years in an instant. Vivian made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and turned away from the doorway. Clay felt the situation spiraling out of control. This child, whoever or whatever she was, had somehow tapped into the deepest secrets of his passengers. Things no one should know. Private shames and buried guilt that people spent lifetimes hiding. And she was exposing them all, one by one, with the casual directness of someone reading from a book. Everyone, please return to your cabins. Clay's voice carried the authority of ownership, of command. We need to give Emma space and time to rest. Jenkins, stay with her. Make sure she has everything she needs. I'll contact the authorities as soon as we're in range. The passengers dispersed slowly, reluctantly, like children being sent away from something fascinating and terrible. A knock at the door made him jump. He quickly closed the folder and returned it to the safe before calling out, "Come in." Jenkins entered, his face grave. "Sir, I thought you should know. The girl, Emma, she's asked to speak with you privately. She says it's time." "Time for what?" "She didn't say, but sir." Jenkins hesitated, something he rarely did. "There's something else. While she was sitting there, I could have sworn I saw her. I mean, I saw through her. Just for a moment, like she was fading, becoming transparent, then she was solid again. I know how that sounds. Nothing about tonight sounds reasonable, Jenkins." Clay stood, straightening his jacket, trying to compose himself. "I'll go to her. You should check on the other passengers. Make sure no one is doing anything rash." "Very good, sir." Jenkins paused at the door. "Mr. Merrick, if I may, whatever that child is, whatever this is about, I've known you for 20 years. You're a good man who's made his share of mistakes. We all have. Don't let her make you forget that." After Jenkins left, Clay stood alone in his cabin for a long moment. The train had resumed moving, he realized. The gentle forward motion had become so familiar, he only noticed it now in its absence and return. Through the window, the dark plains stretched endlessly, and somewhere out there in that darkness was the land where Emma Whitmore had died. He pulled out his father's pocket watch and opened it. Time is the only thing you can't buy back. His father had given him that watch with such hope, such belief that his son would use his gifts wisely, would build something meaningful while staying true to the values he'd been raised with. Clay wondered what his father would think of him now, of the empire built on choices like the one he'd made with the Whitmore ranch, of the daughter who wouldn't speak to him, the wife who'd left because she couldn't recognize the man he'd become, of the success that had cost him everything that actually mattered. He closed the watch and put it away, then walked through the train to the guest cabin. The corridor was empty, the other passengers behind closed doors dealing with their own revelation. The lights flickered again as he walked, and the temperature dropped noticeably despite the heating system running full blast. Emma was waiting for him, sitting exactly as he'd left her, the torn red ribbon still clutched in her small hand. But now, in the dim light of the cabin, he could see what Jenkins had described. She was slightly translucent, as if she were only partially present in this reality. "I remember you now." Clay's voice was barely above a whisper as he entered the cabin and closed the door behind him. "Emma Whitmore, your father came to me asking for help. I could have given it. I had the money, but I wanted your land." Emma nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already known. "You didn't start the fire. You didn't kill us. But you let it happen when you could have prevented it. You saw us struggling, and you waited because dead people don't argue about property values." The words should have been accusatory, harsh, but Emma spoke them with the same gentle matter-of-factness she'd used with everyone else. She wasn't here to condemn. Clay realized she was here to witness, to hold up a mirror and make them all see what they'd spent years refusing to look at. "Why now? Why tonight? Why bring all of us together like this?" Clay sank into the chair across from her, suddenly exhausted. "What do you want from me? I want you to remember, all of you, the people you hurt, the choices you made, the consequences you've spent your lives trying not to think about." Emma's eyes, those ancient eyes in that young face, held his. "Margaret needs to remember the artist whose career she destroyed. Raymond needs to remember the young mother who died because he was too proud to admit he was too tired to operate. Thomas needs to remember his business partner hanging in his garage. Charles needs to remember all the times Vivian cried herself to sleep while he pretended not to notice. And you think forcing us to remember will accomplish what exactly? We can't undo what's done. We can't bring back the dead or repair the damage." Clay's hands clenched on his knees. "Trust me, I've spent enough sleepless nights wishing I could." "Have you?" Emma tilted her head. "Or have you spent nights justifying, explaining to yourself why it was necessary, why it was just business, why you couldn't let sentiment interfere with success? When was the last time you actually let yourself feel the weight of what you did? Clay opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. She was right. Even now, even confronted with the truth, part of his mind was working on rationalization. He'd built walls around these memories, constructed elaborate justifications, convinced himself that regret was a luxury he couldn't afford. "I've built a lot with that money," he said finally. "Employed thousands of people, donated to charities, created opportunities. Blood money can build impressive monuments." Emma's voice remained gentle. "But monuments aren't the same as redemption. You know that. You've always known that." The lights in the cabin flickered more dramatically now, dimming to almost nothing before surging back. Through the window, Clay could see that the darkness outside had taken on a strange quality, as if the train were moving through space that wasn't quite real, wasn't quite bound by normal physical laws. "Where are we?" he asked. "This doesn't feel like the regular route anymore." "We're between," Emma stood. And as she did, she became more transparent still. Clay could see the wall behind her now, could see through her like she was made of glass. Between what was and what could be, between the lies you've told yourselves and the truth you've been avoiding. "This train is taking you somewhere you need to go, Mr. Merrick. Somewhere you've all needed to go for a very long time." A sound came from elsewhere on the train, a cry of anguish that cut through the walls. Margaret's voice, raw with grief. Then another sound, Cross shouting at someone, or something. The train was affecting all of them now, forcing confrontations that had been decades in the making. "What's happening to them?" Clay stood, instinctively moving toward the door. "The same thing that's happening to you." They're remembering, really remembering, not the sanitized versions they've told themselves, but the full truth of what they did and who they hurt. Emma moved toward the window, her form becoming more ethereal with each passing moment. "Margaret is seeing the artist who died in poverty, his daughter who never pursued her own talent because she was too ashamed of her father's failure. Raymond is watching his patient's children grow up without their mother, seeing every milestone she missed because of his mistake." She grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't turn. Not locked, exactly, but resistant, as if the metal itself was refusing to cooperate. "Let me out. If they're in distress, I need to help them." "You can't help them with this. No one can help them but themselves." Emma turned back to face him, and now she was barely visible at all, just a shimmer in the air, a suggestion of a form. Only her eyes remained vivid, burning with that ancient knowledge. "Just like no one can help you face what you need to face, except yourself." The cabin around them began to shift. The walls remained solid, but something else was appearing, overlaying the present like a double-exposed photograph. Clay could see another room taking shape, rough wooden walls, simple furniture, a kitchen table where a family sat, having dinner. Robert Whitmore, younger than Clay remembered, his face open and honest. Sarah, his wife, laughing at something her husband had said. And Emma, 8 years old, vibrant with life, the red ribbon bright in her hair. She was talking animatedly about school, about a drawing she'd made, about her dreams of becoming an artist when she grew up. "No," Clay tried to look away, but he couldn't. The vision held him captive. "I don't want to see this. That's the problem. None of you wanted to see. You made your choices, and then you looked away from the consequences." Emma's voice came from everywhere now, not just from her fading form. "But the consequences didn't disappear just because you stopped looking." The scene at the dinner table continued, Robert's smile fading as he brought up the electrical problem, the danger they were living with every day. Sarah's hand on his arm, reassuring, saying they'd figure it out. They always figured things out. Emma, oblivious to the adult worries, still chattering about her day. Then the scene shifted. Robert Whitmore standing in an office, Clay's office, much smaller than the one he had now, furnished with second-hand furniture from his father's ranch. Robert holding his hat in work-worn hands, trying to maintain his dignity while essentially begging for help. And there was Clay, younger, harder, hungrier, looking at this desperate man and seeing only an opportunity, hearing the words about the electrical danger, about the risk to his family, and calculating how long it might take for disaster to strike, saying no with a practiced expression of regret that meant nothing. I was building something. Clay's voice broke. I needed that land. The oil there, it was the foundation of everything I became. Yes, Emma's voice was fading along with her form, and the foundation of everything you became was built on our deaths, on my death. Do you know what my last thoughts were, Mr. Merrick? I was 8 years old, and I died thinking about a drawing I'd left at school, worried that my teacher would be disappointed that I hadn't finished it. That's what I was thinking while I burned. Clay fell to his knees, the weight of it finally breaking through every defense he'd constructed. 37 years of justification crumbled, and he saw it all clearly for the first time. Not just a business transaction, not just an unfortunate tragedy he'd capitalized on, but a little girl who'd never become the artist she'd dreamed of being, a family extinguished, a son left alone, all because Clay had decided his ambition mattered more than their lives. I'm sorry. The words felt pathetically inadequate. God, Emma, I'm so sorry. Are you just sorry you have to feel it now? Her voice was almost gone, barely a whisper. That's what you need to figure out, Mr. Merrick. All of you, whether you're sorry for what you did, or just sorry you can't avoid it anymore. The vision of the Whitmore family faded, but not completely. It lingered at the edges of Clay's perception, a constant reminder. Through the walls he could hear the other passengers, their own confrontations reaching crescendos. Margaret sobbing, words about forgiveness and fraud, tumbling out. Raymond's voice, hoarse with confession, speaking to someone who wasn't there, or maybe was there, in whatever space between realities this train had entered. Thomas's voice rose in anger, then broke into something rawer, more vulnerable. I know what I did. I've always known. He called me that night, begging me to reconsider, and I hung up on him. I hung up and went to dinner like nothing was wrong. The Ashfords were quieter, but Clay could hear them through the walls, speaking in low, intense tones. Vivian's voice carried pain that had been carefully hidden for years. I knew about the affair within a week. I could smell her perfume on your shirts. But I said nothing because I was too proud to admit my marriage was failing, too afraid to start over. Vivian, please. Charles sounded broken. I thought I'd hidden it. I thought you'd never know. That's worse, don't you see? You thought you'd gotten away with it. You came home and kissed me and held my hand at parties, all while believing I was too stupid or too blind to see the truth. The affair hurt, but the contempt hurt more. Clay pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady. The cabin door finally yielded when he tried it again, and he stumbled into the corridor. The train was still moving, but the scenery outside had become abstract, impossible. Shapes that might have been landscape or might have been memories flowed past the window. Time seemed elastic, stretched, and compressed simultaneously. Jenkins stood in the main corridor, his face pale, but composed. Of all of them, the conductor seemed least affected by whatever was happening. Sir, I've tried to maintain order, but everyone is experiencing something. Should I stop the train? Can you? Clay asked. Jenkins moved to the control panel mounted on the wall. Tried the emergency brake. Nothing happened. We're not in control anymore, Mr. Merrick. The train is taking us where it needs to go. Margaret's cabin door was ajar, and Clay could see her kneeling on the floor. Photographs spread around her. They were old photos, newspaper clippings, documents that looked like they'd been hidden away for years. One showed a young man with intense eyes, standing in front of a canvas, brush in hand, the artist she'd destroyed. His name was David Castellano. Margaret's voice was thick with tears. He was brilliant, truly brilliant, but he was also poor, desperate for recognition. When I offered to authenticate his work as a lost Renaissance piece, he trusted me, God help him. He trusted me. She looked up at Clay, her carefully composed facade, completely shattered. I built my entire career on that lie. Every piece I've authenticated since, people trusted my judgment because of that first discovery. But it was all a fraud from the beginning. Margaret, Clay stepped into the cabin, unsure what to say, what comfort he could possibly offer. He died 6 years after I made my fortune off his work. Died poor and bitter. His real talent never recognized because everyone thought of him as the forger who'd tried to fool the art world. His daughter, Sophia, had such potential, but she never pursued art because she was too ashamed of her father's reputation. That talent, lost. All because I wanted success more than I wanted truth. Down the corridor, Dr. Raymond Cross emerged from his cabin. His distinguished bearing was gone, replaced by the hunched shoulders of a man carrying unbearable weight. He walked like someone in a trance, moved past Clay and Margaret without seeing them, talking to empty air. Her name was Catherine Moore. She was 31 years old, mother of 3 children under the age of 7. She'd come in for routine surgery, should have been a straightforward procedure. Raymond's hands moved as if he were still holding surgical instruments. But I'd been awake for 20 hours. My hands were shaking. I should have passed the case to another surgeon. Should have admitted I was too impaired to operate safely. But I was the best. Everyone said so. I believed my own legend. He stopped at a window, pressed his palms against the glass. She died on the table, and I lied in the report. Said there were unexpected complications, that no one could have saved her. Her husband believed me. Her children grew up believing their mother's death was just tragic bad luck. But it wasn't. It was my pride, my refusal to admit I was human, fallible, in need of rest. Thomas Berkeley's door opened, and he emerged with a bottle in one hand, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. His tie was loose, his shirt untucked, and his eyes were red. David Harrison. That was his name. My business partner, my friend. He took a long drink directly from the bottle. We built the company together, 50-50 partners. But when the real money started coming in, when we had a chance to go truly big, I saw my opportunity. I manipulated the books, made it look like David had been embezzling, presented fabricated evidence to the board. They believed me because I was careful, meticulous, and because David was too honest to imagine someone would do that to him. Thomas slid down the wall, sitting on the phone of the corridor. They fired him, stripped his shares, destroyed his reputation. I got it all. Became sole owner of a company we'd built together from nothing. What happened to him? Clay asked, though he already knew the answer from what Emma had said. He tried to fight it at first, hired lawyers, tried to prove his innocence. But I'd been too thorough. Everyone believed the lie. His wife left him. His friends abandoned him. 6 months later, I got a call that he'd hanged himself in his garage. Thomas looked up at Clay with eyes that held no hope. His widow and kids lost everything. I became a billionaire. I told myself he was weak, that he should have fought harder. But I know the truth. I murdered him as surely as if I'd kicked the chair out from under him myself. The Ashfords emerged together, Vivian leaning on Charles like she needed physical support to stay upright. Charles's usual jovial expression was gone, replaced by raw vulnerability that made him look both older and somehow more genuine. 20 years ago, I had an affair that lasted 6 months. Charles spoke to all of them, confessing to an audience that had become a jury. A colleague, someone young and ambitious and impressed by the Ashford name. I thought I was being discreet. I thought Vivian never knew, but she did. She knew and she said nothing. And that silence has poisoned everything between us ever since. Vivian's voice was quiet but steady. I said nothing because I was raised to believe that marriage meant endurance, that a good wife ignored her husband's indiscretions. But the silence became a wall between us. Every smile I gave you, Charles, every time I held your hand in public, I was lying, not to you, but to myself, pretending I'd forgiven you when really I'd just buried the pain so deep I could almost forget it was there. They stood there in the corridor, 6 successful people who'd spent decades building empires and reputations, now reduced to their raw truth. The train continued its impossible journey through space that wasn't quite space, time that wasn't quite time. The walls between them and their pasts had dissolved completely. Emma appeared at the end of the corridor, more solid now than she'd been in the cabin. She walked toward them, her bare feet making no sound on the polished wood floor. In her hand, the torn red ribbon had transformed somehow, become cleaner, brighter, more real. "Do you understand now?" Her voice carried that same gentle authority. "You've all spent so long building walls between yourselves and the truth. But the truth doesn't disappear just because you stop looking at it. It waits, it grows, it becomes the foundation of everything you build, and eventually the foundation cracks. What do you want from us?" Margaret's question was barely a whisper. "Punishment. Revenge. We can't undo what we've done. We can't bring back the dead or repair the damage." "No, you can't." Emma stopped in front of them, and Clay noticed that behind her, the corridor seemed to extend infinitely, filled with shadows that might have been other people. All the victims, all the lives damaged by the choices made by the people on this train. But you can choose what you do next. You can choose whether to keep building on foundations of guilt and justification, or whether to start something new, something honest. The train's whistle blew a long, mournful sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The lights flickered dramatically, and when they steadied, Clay saw that the shadows behind Emma had become more distinct. He could see David Castellano, the artist Margaret had destroyed, looking at her with an expression that was neither accusatory nor forgiving, simply present. Catherine Moore, the young mother Raymond had failed, holding the hands of 3 small children. David Harrison, Thomas's partner, the rope burns still visible on his neck. And there, behind Emma, stood Robert and Sarah Whitmore, holding each other the way they must have in their final moments. Sarah's hand reached out toward her daughter, and Emma turned to look at her parents. For the first time since she'd appeared on the tracks, the child looked like a child, vulnerable and small and desperately wanting her mother's embrace. "Wait," Clay's voice cut through the moment. "Emma, before you go, before whatever this is ends, I need to know, why me? Why all of us together? This can't be coincidence." Emma turned back to face him, her parents' forms fading slightly, but remaining visible in the background. The corridor had become a space where past and present existed simultaneously, where the boundaries between reality and memory had dissolved completely. "It's never coincidence, Mr. Merrick. You invited these people onto your train for business reasons, strategic relationships, but there was another reason, one you weren't conscious of. Deep down, you recognized something in each of them, something that mirrored what you'd been hiding in yourself." She gestured to the group, her small hand encompassing them all. Margaret, who built success on a lie. Raymond, who let pride override safety. Thomas, who destroyed a friend for profit. Charles and Vivian, who chose comfortable deception over painful truth. You brought together people whose guilt matched your own, as if surrounding yourself with similar sinners might make your own sins feel smaller. Clay felt the truth of her words like a physical blow. She was right. He'd been drawn to these people not just for their business acumen or social connections, but because on some unconscious level, he'd recognized kindred spirits. People who'd made the hard choices, who'd prioritized success over conscience, who'd learned to live with the weight of their decisions. But there's something else. Emma moved back to the center of their group, and as she walked, the cabin walls around them seemed to fall away. They were standing now in a vast, empty space, the train somehow continuing its journey while also being nowhere at all. "Something none of you know. Something I need to show you." The space around them began to fill with images, not visions this time, but documents. Clay recognized them gradually. Financial records, legal papers, correspondence. His own records, dating back to that first land purchase from the Whitmore estate. "After you bought our land, Mr. Merrick, you drilled for oil, found it within 3 months. Made your first million within a year. Emma's finger traced lines on documents that floated in the air around them. But look closer. Look at the mineral rights paperwork, the original surveys. Clay studied the documents, and slowly a horrifying realization began to dawn. These surveys, they're dated 6 months before the fire, before I even approached your father's land. Yes, Emma's voice was calm, factual. You knew there was oil there long before the fire. You had the surveys done secretly, knowing that if your father found out what his land was worth, he'd never sell. You needed him desperate. You needed him to have no choice. No. Clay shook his head violently. I didn't sabotage the electrical system. I didn't start the fire. You didn't have to. Emma pulled forward another document, an inspection report. But you did pay the county electrical inspector to overlook the dangerous wiring in his regular safety checks. You did make sure that when my father tried to get emergency repairs, every contractor in the area was suddenly too busy or too expensive. You didn't light the match, Mr. Merrick. But you made absolutely certain the house would burn. The corridor fell silent. Even the train's constant rhythm seemed to pause. Clay felt the floor dropping out from under him as the full scope of what he'd done crashed through every remaining defense. He hadn't just been opportunistic, he'd been predatory. He'd orchestrated the circumstances that led to the Whitmore family's death as surely as if he'd locked them in that house and set it ablaze himself. All for oil, all for money, all for the foundation of an empire that had brought him nothing but hollow success. I didn't remember. His voice was barely audible. I buried it so deep, convinced myself I'd just been smart, that I'd recognized an opportunity, but I orchestrated it. God help me, I orchestrated their death. Margaret gasped. The inspector. I remember reading about him in your early business fights. I thought it was just you being thorough, making sure properties were properly evaluated, but you were bribing him to create dangerous situations you could exploit. It's worse than that. Thomas stepped forward, his financial mind cutting through the emotional fog. If you were doing this with the Whitmore property, you were probably doing it with others. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a business model. Emma nodded slowly, and more documents appeared, floating in the impossible space around them, property after property, each with a similar pattern. Geological surveys done in secret, safety inspections manipulated, desperate owners facing manufactured crises. Clay's name appearing again and again, acquiring land at fractions of its value after convenient tragedies. 15 properties in your first 5 years. Emma's voice remained gentle, but the weight of the words was crushing. 7 fires, 3 floods from accidental dam failures, 2 structural collapses, 1 gas explosion. 43 people died in total, families destroyed, lives ended, all so you could build your empire on their ashes. Clay fell to his knees again, but this time there was no recovery, no pulling himself together. This was too big, too monstrous. He'd thought he was confronting one terrible choice, one family's death. But Emma was revealing a pattern of destruction that had spanned years. He wasn't just a man who'd made a mistake. He was a serial killer who'd used bureaucracy and capitalism as his weapons. I'm a monster. The words came out broken, ragged. Everything I've built, everything I am, it's all built on mass murder. Dr. Raymond moved closer, his own guilt momentarily forgotten in the face of this revelation. Clayton, you need to breathe. You're going into shock. Shock? Clay laughed, the sound edged with hysteria. I just learned I'm responsible for 43 deaths. 43 people, Raymond. Families, children. And I buried it so deep, I actually convinced myself I was just a shrewd businessman. Margaret knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. We all buried our truths. We all convinced ourselves of lies. But this, Clayton, this is beyond anything I imagined. Thomas stood apart, his expression unreadable. The inspector who you bribed, What happened to him? Emma pulled forward one more document. An obituary. He killed himself 12 years into his arrangement with Mr. Merrick. Left a suicide note confessing to taking bribes, but not naming who paid him. His daughter found the note and destroyed it to protect his reputation. She never knew the full scope of what he'd been part of. Another victim, Vivian's, Bois's, was hollow. Another life destroyed by these choices. It never ends, does it? The ripples just keep spreading. Charles looked at Clay with something between pity and horror. All those years, all those business deals we did together. I thought you were just better at seeing opportunities than the rest of us. But you weren't seeing opportunities, you were creating disasters. Emma moved to stand directly in front of Clay, her small form casting an impossible shadow in the sourceless light. This is what you needed to remember. Not just my family's death, but all of them. Every life your ambition cost. Every child who died because you wanted oil more than you wanted to be human. Why? Clay looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. Why show me this? Why not just let me stay ignorant? Wouldn't that be more merciful? Mercy isn't the same as comfort. Emma reached out and touched his face, and her hand was solid now, warm, real. You can't make different choices if you don't know what your choices actually were. None of you. She turned to address all of them, her voice taking on a resonance that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her small form. You've all been shown your truths tonight, the full scope of what you did and who it hurt. Now you have to choose what to do with that knowledge. You can return to your old lives, bury these memories again, convince yourselves it was all a dream or a delusion. The world will let you do that. Success protects itself. The space around them began to shift again. The documents faded. The impossible corridor started to resolve back into the familiar confines of the train. But something was different now. The air felt charged, pregnant with possibility. Or, Emma continued, you can choose differently. You can't undo what's done. You can't bring back the dead. But you can decide what your wealth and power does from this moment forward. You can choose to build something real instead of something built on bodies. The train's whistle blew again, and Clay felt movement beneath him. They were approaching some destination that hadn't been on the original itinerary. Through the windows, he could see light ahead, bright and clear, cutting through the darkness that had surrounded them. Jenkins appeared at the far end of the corridor, and for the first time since this journey began, he looked shaken. Sir, we're approaching some kind of junction. It's not on any map I've ever seen. The engineers say the tracks are splitting, giving us a choice of direction. Clay pushed himself to his feet, using the wall for support. His legs felt weak, his entire body trembling from the revelations that had been forced upon him. But there was something in Jenkins's words that cut through the shock. A choice. Even now, even after everything, there was still a choice to be made. Show me. His voice was hoarse, but steady enough. The group moved together toward the front of the train, drawn by the same invisible pull. Through the forward windows, Clay could see what Jenkins meant. The tracks ahead split into two distinct paths, illuminated by a railroad lantern that sat at the junction point, its light impossibly bright in the darkness. One track curved to the right, and beyond it, Clay could see familiar terrain, the route to Santa Fe, the continuation of their original journey. Through some trick of the light or this strange space they'd entered, he could see beyond the immediate future. He saw himself returning to his life, to his business, to his empire. The memories of this night would fade, become dreamlike and uncertain. He would go back to being Clayton Merrick, oil baron, successful and respected and hollow. The other track led straight ahead into brilliant light, so bright it should have hurt to look at, but somehow didn't. Clay couldn't see what lay beyond that light, but he could feel it. It was a path that meant exposure, confession, the complete dismantling of everything he'd built. It meant facing not just his own conscience, But the law, public judgment, the full weight of accountability for 43 deaths, and the ruins of countless lives. What happens if we take the right track? Margaret asked, voicing what they were all thinking. Do we forget? Does all of this just become a strange dream we had? Emma had followed them, her form solidifying further as they approached the junction. You'll remember enough to feel uncomfortable for a while, enough to maybe be a bit kinder, a bit more generous. But the full weight of it will fade. You'll convince yourselves it was stress, or food poisoning, or some kind of shared delusion. Within a year, you'll be back to who you were before tonight. And the left track, Dr. Raymond's voice was quiet. The one that goes into the light? That's the harder path. That's accountability. That's choosing to face what you've done and accept the consequences. For you, Mr. Merrick, it means confessing to those 43 deaths, turning over evidence, likely spending the rest of your life in prison. For Margaret, it means publicly admitting to decades of art fraud, losing your reputation, and possibly your freedom. Raymond, it means reopening the case of Catherine Moore's death, facing a malpractice investigation, losing your medical license. Emma turned to Thomas. It means finding David Harrison's family and telling them the truth, giving them everything you stole from them, and facing criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Finally, she looked at Charles and Vivian. And for you two, it means the hardest work of all. It means choosing to live in truth instead of comfortable lies, to rebuild your marriage on honesty or admit it can't be saved. There's no legal punishment for you, but the emotional work is just as demanding. Thomas laughed bitterly. So we can take the easy path and go back to our lives, or we can take the hard path and destroy everything we've built. That's not really a choice, isn't it? Vivian stepped forward, closer to the window. We've already destroyed everything. We just didn't realize. Our lives, our successes, they're built on foundations of guilt and lies. Taking the right track doesn't mean keeping what we have. It just means continuing to live in the illusion that we have something worth keeping. Vivian. Charles reached for his wife's hand, but she pulled away gently. No, Charles, I've spent 20 years pulling away from truths I didn't want to face. I'm tired. I'm so tired of pretending. She looked at her husband with a clarity that had been missing for years. If we take the right track, we'll go home and continue playing our roles, but we'll never be real with each other again. The gap between us will just keep growing until one day we look across the dinner table at a stranger. Charles's face crumpled. I don't want to lose you. Then maybe we need to choose the harder path together. Maybe we need to find out who we actually are underneath all the pretending, even if it's painful. Clay watched this exchange, feeling the weight of his own choice pressing down on him. He thought about his daughter, Rebecca. If he took the right track, went back to his life, she would continue keeping her distance, raising his grandchildren without him. But if he took the left track, if he confessed to everything, what would that do to her? Would she be destroyed by the revelation that her father was a murderer? Or would there be some possibility of real connection, built on truth instead of the empty gestures he'd been offering? Margaret had moved to stand beside Vivian, and the two women looked at each other with an understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance. I've lived my entire adult life inside a lie, Margaret said. Every authentication, every expert opinion, people trusted me because of that first fraud. David Castellano deserves to have his name cleared. His daughter Sophia deserves to know her father wasn't a forger, that he was a victim, even if it means I lose everything. You will lose everything, Thomas pointed out. Your reputation, your career, probably your theorem. And for what? Castellano is dead. Clearing his name won't bring him back. No. Margaret's voice was stronger now, but it might give his daughter permission to be the artist she was born to be. It might let her reclaim the legacy that I stole. That's worth more than my comfort. Dr. Raymond had been silent, staring at the junction ahead. Finally he spoke. Catherine Moore's children are adults now. 28 years have passed. They've built their lives around the story that their mother's death was unavoidable. If I reopen that wound, tell them it was my negligence, my pride, I'll be taking away the peace they've found, or giving them truth, Emma said softly, which is its own kind of peace, even when it hurts. Her oldest daughter became a doctor. Raymond's voice cracked. She became a doctor because she wanted to honor her mother's memory, to save lives the way she believed doctors had tried to save her mother. If she learns that a doctor's negligence killed Catherine, what does that do to her? It lets her practice medicine with full knowledge of its dangers, Clay found himself saying, with humility instead of the arrogance that killed her mother. Raymond, you know that's valuable. You know that's what the profession needs. Raymond looked at Clay, and something passed between them. Recognition of shared burden, of the terrible weight of choosing truth over comfort. Thomas remained apart from the group, his arms crossed, his expression closed. This is insane. We're talking about destroying our lives, going to prison, losing everything we've worked for, and for what? To satisfy some moral imperative that won't actually change anything. The dead stay dead. The damage is done. All we'd be doing is adding more suffering to the world. Is that what you really believe? Emma walked toward Thomas, her small form somehow commanding in the confined space. Or is that what you need to believe to justify choosing the easy path? There's nothing wrong with the easy path. Thomas's voice rose. Survival, self-preservation, these are natural instincts. We're not obligated to destroy ourselves for the sake of some abstract principle. No, you're not obligated, Emma agreed. That's what makes it a choice. If it were mandatory, it wouldn't mean anything. But you need to understand what you're choosing. If you take the right track, you don't just forget what happened here. You choose to live knowing you could have faced your truth and chose comfort instead. That knowledge will poison everything, even if you can't fully remember why. The train was slowing as it approached the junction, giving them time to decide. Jenkins stood at the control panel, his hand hovering over the track selector. Mr. Merrick, I need direction. Which way are we going? Clay pulled out his father's pocket watch, held it in his palm. The silver was warm from being in his pocket, worn smooth by decades of anxious touching. Time is the only thing you can't buy back. His father had given him this watch with such hope, such faith, that Clay would use his life wisely. Dad died 10 years ago, Clay said to no one in particular. He never knew what I'd done to build my fortune. I made sure of that. Visited in an hospital those last weeks. Held his hand, let him believe his son had stayed true to the values he'd taught me. He died proud of me. Clayton. Margaret's voice was gentle. You don't have to carry this alone. Whatever you decide, we're all in this together. But that's just it. Clay looked up at her. We're not all in this together. The consequences aren't equal. I'm looking at life in prison for 43 deaths. You're looking at professional ruin, but probably not jail time. Raymond might lose his license, but he's old enough to retire anyway. Thomas would lose his fortune, but he has skills. He could rebuild. Charles and Vivian, you're looking at emotional work but no legal consequences at all. He turned to face them all. If I choose the left track, the path of accountability, I'm choosing to die in prison. I'm 62 years old. Even with a plea deal, I'm looking at decades behind bars. I'll never hold my grandchildren. I'll never have a chance to make things right with my daughter in any meaningful way. I'll just be a monster she has to explain to her children. And if you choose the right track, Dr. Raymond asked quietly, then I go back to being successful and lonely and hollow. I keep building on foundations of bodies. I die wealthy and empty, knowing I could have chosen differently, but didn't have the courage. Clay's hands tightened on the watch. Either way I lose, but only one way means something. Thomas laughed, the sound bitter. Listen to yourself. You're romanticizing martyrdom. There's no nobility in throwing your life away when it won't bring anyone back, won't undo any damage. It's just waste on top of waste. Maybe. Clay met Thomas's eyes. Or maybe it's the only way to transform waste into meaning. The people we killed, the lives we destroyed, they're gone. We can't change that. But we can choose whether their deaths meant nothing or whether they become the catalyst for something different. The junction was almost upon them now. Through the window, Clay could see both paths clearly. The right track looked so inviting, so familiar. He could almost feel the comfort of his leather chair, the weight of business decisions that felt important, the carefully constructed life he'd spent decades building. The left track still blazed with that impossible light, and now Clay thought he could see shapes within it, not the victims this time, but possibilities. A version of himself that might emerge from the other side of accountability. Broken, certainly. Imprisoned, likely. But maybe, finally, real. I can't make this decision for everyone. Clay's voice was steady now. Decision crystallizing. Jenkins, I'll tell you which track to take. But anyone who wants to can get off this train right here. The others can call for help from the next station. Get you picked up. You don't have to follow me down whatever path I choose. We're miles from anywhere, Charles pointed out. Getting off here means waiting in the cold and dark for hours. Better that than choosing a path you don't believe in. Clay looked at each of them in turn. Because once we commit, once Jenkins throws that switch, there's no going back. Emma's made that clear. This is the moment. This is the only moment when the choice is truly ours. Vivian was the first to speak. I'm staying, whatever track you choose. I'm staying because I'm tired of running from truth, and I think that's what the right track really is. Just more running. Charles looked at his wife with an expression of wonder and pain. Then I stay too, because wherever you're going, I need to go, even if it's into something that terrifies me. Margaret nodded. I'm staying. I've spent my entire life authenticating art, determining what's real and what's false. It's time I applied that same scrutiny to my own life. I'm staying, and I hope you choose the left track, Clayton. Because I don't think I have the courage to choose it myself, but if you lead, I'll follow. Dr. Raymond stepped forward. I'm staying as well. I've spent my career making life and death decisions. It's time I made one about my own life that actually means something. Catherine Moore deserves better than my continued silence. Thomas remained apart, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at the approaching junction. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. David Harrison was my best friend. We met in college, built the company from a dream we shared in a dorm room. When I betrayed him, when I destroyed him, I didn't just kill a business partner. I killed the one person who actually knew me, who believed in me before I had any reason to believe in myself. He turned to face them, and his eyes were wet. I've told myself for 15 years that he was weak, that he should have fought harder, that his suicide was his own choice. But that's a lie. I murdered him, and every day since, I've been killing the part of myself that was capable of friendship, of trust, of anything real. I'm staying, and I'm praying you choose the left track, Clayton, because I don't trust myself to make the right choice alone. Emma had been standing quietly, watching them commit themselves one by one. Now she moved to Clay's side, took his hand in her small one. The touch was warm, solid, more real than anything Clay had felt in decades. You're all braver than you know, she said softly. The hardest thing in the world is to stand in full knowledge of what you've done and choose truth anyway. Most people never find that courage. Most people aren't backed into a corner by a supernatural child on a train that's traveled outside of reality. Thomas said, but there was no bitterness in his voice now, just exhaustion and something that might have been relief. Clay looked down at Emma. If I choose the left track, what happens to you? Do you finally get to rest? Do you get to be with your parents? Emma's smile was sad and knowing. I'm not really the Emma who died in that fire, Mr. Merrick. I'm the part of your conscience that you buried with her, the part that knew what you'd done was wrong but got silenced by ambition and justification. If you choose truth, you're not setting me free. You're reclaiming me, taking back the part of yourself you've been missing all these years. And the other. Clay gestured to the shadows that had appeared behind Emma, the victims who'd been watching this whole exchange. They're parts of all of you, the witnesses you've been trying to forget, the voices you've been drowning out with success and busyness and carefully constructed lies. If you choose the left track, you're choosing to let them back in, to live with full awareness of what your choices cost. The junction was upon them now. Jenkins looked back at Clay, his weathered face patient, waiting for direction. The train had slowed to barely a crawl, giving them these final moments to decide. Clay thought about Rebecca, about her children, his grandchildren, who he'd never been allowed to meet. If he chose the left track, if he confessed everything, they would grow up knowing their grandfather was a mass murderer. That knowledge would shape them, mark them, become part of their story. But if he chose the right track, they would grow up knowing him as the hollow, distant man who sent checks and never showed up, who had money but no warmth, success but no connection. Was that really better? He thought about his father, about the values the old rancher had tried to instill: honesty, hard work, taking responsibility for your actions. Clay had kept the watch but abandoned everything it represented. What would his father choose, standing at this junction? Clay already knew the answer. His father would have never gotten here in the first place. Would have helped Robert Whitmore fix that electrical system. Would have paid for it himself if necessary, because that's what neighbors did. Would have never seen a struggling family as an opportunity to exploit. But his father was gone, and Clay was here, at this impossible junction, holding the weight of 43 deaths and a lifetime of choices that had led to this moment. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't bring back Emma Whitmore or any of the other. He couldn't undo the empire built on their graves, but he could choose what happened next. Clay looked at Jenkins, at this man who'd served him faithfully for 20 years, who'd known something was wrong but stayed anyway, perhaps hoping that someday his employer would find the courage to face it. Jenkins, take the left track. The words came out clear and strong, and as soon as he said them, Clay felt something shift inside him. Not relief, exactly, and not peace, but a kind of rightness, a sense that for the first time in decades he was moving in a direction that aligned with something true. "Sir, are you certain?" Jenkins's hand remained on the switch. "Once I throw this, there's no going back." "I'm certain. Take us into the light." Jenkins nodded once, then pulled the lever. The train shifted slightly as the wheels aligned with the left track, and they began moving toward the brilliant light that had been waiting for them. The moment they committed to the track, everything changed. The light grew brighter, more intense, but instead of being painful, it felt cleansing, like standing in a waterfall of pure illumination. The walls of the train became transparent, and Clay could see through them to something beyond. He saw Rebecca, not as she was now, but as she'd been at 8 years old, the same age Emma had been when she died. Rebecca laughing, running through the old ranch, her mother calling her in for dinner. Clay remembered that day, remembered being too busy with a conference call to join them, prioritizing a business deal over his daughter's request to go riding together. Then the vision shifted, showed him Rebecca at 16, crying in her room, after he'd missed another recital, another school event, another moment that couldn't be recovered. Showed him Sarah trying to explain to their daughter that Daddy loved her. He was just very busy building something important. Showed Rebecca's face hardening, year by year, learning that love was something you claimed to feel but never actually demonstrated. The light showed him, not just what he'd done, but what he'd failed to do. The birthdays missed, the conversations avoided, the emotional walls built brick by brick until his own daughter became a stranger. He'd killed 43 people through his pursuit of wealth, but he'd also killed the relationship with his own child through that same pursuit. Margaret was crying now, the light showing her similar visions. David Castellano in his studio, creating beauty that would never be recognized. His daughter Sophia, hiding her own artistic gifts, because she'd learned that art, brought only shame and poverty. All the ways one lie had rippled outward, destroying potential and crushing dreams. Dr. Raymond saw Catherine Moore's children growing up without their mother. The oldest daughter becoming a doctor but carrying an anger she couldn't name, a grief that shaped her treatment of patients. The middle child, afraid of hospitals, of doctors, unable to shake the feeling that medical professionals couldn't be trusted. The youngest, barely remembering his mother at all, growing up with a hole where her love should have been. Thomas saw David Harrison's widow, struggling to explain to their children why their father was gone, why they'd lost everything, why people who'd been friends suddenly wouldn't return their calls. Saw the children growing up bitter, distrustful, carrying wounds that would shape how they loved, how they trusted, how they moved through the world. Charles and Vivian saw their marriage from the outside, saw how the affair had created a chasm that decades of pretending couldn't bridge, saw opportunities for healing that had been missed, moments when truth could have saved them, chances for real connection that had slipped away because they'd chosen comfort over courage. The light showed them everything, not to punish, but to illuminate, to make visible what had been hidden, to force them to see the full scope of the damage their choices had caused. And then, as the train moved deeper into the light, the visions began to shift. Clay saw Rebecca again, but this time older, current, saw her receiving a phone call, her father's voice on the other end, shaking but honest. "I need to tell you something. I need to tell you who I really am, what I've really done." Saw Rebecca's face as she listened, the shock and horror and grief washing over her, but also something else, a kind of understanding, as if pieces of a puzzle she'd been working on her whole life suddenly clicked into place. The emotional distance, the workaholism, the inability to connect. It all made terrible sense now. The vision showed Rebecca making a choice of her own, to cut him off completely, to protect her children from the truth, or to lean into the pain, to allow her father to be real with her for the first time in their relationship, even if that reality was monstrous. The future branched in the vision, showing both possibilities, and Clay understood that her choice would be her own, just as this choice had been his. Margaret saw Sophia Castellano, now in her 50s, receiving a letter that explained everything. Saw the woman's face as she read about her father's innocence, about the fraud that had destroyed him. Saw her going to her attic, pulling out dusty art supplies she'd hidden away decades ago. Saw her hand shaking as she picked up a brush for the first time in 30 years, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. Raymond saw Catherine Moore's oldest daughter, now a surgeon herself, reading the reopened case file on her mother's death. Saw her anger, her grief, her sense of betrayal, but also saw her, months later, implementing new protocols in her hospital to prevent fatigue-related errors, creating systems that would save lives, because she now understood how easily lives could be lost. Saw her mother's death transformed from meaningless tragedy into catalyst for change. Thomas saw David Harrison's children, now adults, receiving restitution that could never replace their father, but might heal some of the financial wounds his betrayal had caused. Saw the oldest son, who'd grown up bitter and angry, making a choice to break that cycle, to not pass the poison of betrayal down to his own children. Saw the possibility of generational healing beginning with an acknowledgement of truth. Charles and Vivian saw themselves in a small apartment, having sold the mansion, having stepped away from the social circles that had defined them. Saw themselves at a simple dinner table, holding hands, speaking honestly for the first time in decades. Saw the hard work of rebuilding trust, of learning who they actually were underneath the performance. It wasn't easy in the vision, wasn't comfortable, but it was real. The light reached its peak intensity, and for a moment, Clay felt like he was being unmade, broken down into his component parts. Every lie he'd told, every rationalization he'd constructed, every wall he'd built, all of it was being stripped away. It was excruciating, like having skin peeled off layer by layer. But beneath the pain was something he'd forgotten existed, a core of himself that predated the empire, predated the success, predated the choices that had led him here. The young man who'd left his father's ranch with hope and ambition, yes, but also with values, with the capacity for genuine connection, with a conscience that hadn't yet learned to be silent. Emma's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. This is who you could be, not who you were, because you can't go back to innocence once it's lost. But who you could become if you choose to build on truth instead of lies. It won't be easy. Prison will break parts of you. The public exposure will be humiliating. You'll lose everything you've built, but you'll gain something you've been missing for 37 years. What? Clay's voice was raw. What will I gain? Yourself. The light began to recede, and Clay found himself back in the train, fully present in his body again. But he was changed. They all were. The weight of what they'd seen, what they'd been shown, settled over them like a mantle they would carry for the rest of their lives. The train was moving on solid tracks again. The junction behind them. Through the window, Clay could see normal landscape, normal darkness. But he knew they weren't returning to the world they'd left. They were arriving somewhere new, to a future they'd chosen by taking the left track. Jenkins turned from the controls, his face peaceful. We're approaching Santa Fe. We'll be there within the hour. Clay nodded, then looked at his fellow passengers. Margaret, Raymond, Thomas, Charles, Vivian. They looked back at him, and in their eyes he saw the same mixture of terror and determination that he felt in his own chest. They'd chosen the hard path, and now they had to walk it. Emma stood before them one final time, and she looked different now. Not translucent, not ghostly, but fully present and somehow at peace. The torn red ribbon in her hand was clean and whole, vibrant red against the white of her dress, which no longer looked dirty or damaged. Thank you, she said simply, for choosing truth, for having the courage to face what you've been running from. It won't erase what was done, but it transforms it into something that can grow, instead of something that just festers. Clay knelt down to her level, eye to eye with the manifestation of the conscience he'd buried so long ago. Will I see you again? Every day. Emma smiled, and it was the first time her expression had held genuine warmth. But not like this. You'll see me in the choices you make from now on, in the moments when you have to decide between comfort and truth. I won't be a separate thing anymore. I'll be part of you again, the way I should have been all along. She turned to each of them in turn, offering a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. To Margaret, to Raymond, to Thomas, to Charles and Vivian. Then she began to fade, not dying, but integrating, becoming part of something larger than herself. As she disappeared, Clay felt something shift inside his chest, a weight that had been there so long he'd stopped noticing it was gone, replaced by a different kind of heaviness. This new weight was accountability, responsibility, the full knowledge of what he'd done and what he needed to do next. It was heavy, yes, but it was honest weight, not the crushing pressure of buried truth. The train rolled into Santa Fe station just as the sun was rising. The platform was empty at this early hour, the city still waking up. Jenkins brought the iron horse to a smooth stop, the brakes sighing like they too were exhausted from the night's journey. For a long moment, no one moved. They sat in the observation car, watching the light grow stronger outside, knowing that when they stepped off this train, everything would change. There would be phone calls to make, confessions to deliver, consequences to face. The rest of their lives stretched ahead, unknown and daunting. Clay pulled out his father's pocket watch one last time. He opened it, read the inscription with new eyes. Time is the only thing you can't buy back. Use it wisely. He'd wasted so much time, decades spent building monuments to his own ambition while ignoring what actually mattered. But he had time left. Not much, given that he was probably going to spend it in prison. But some, enough to make different choices, enough to try to transform the damage he'd caused into something that might help others. I'm going to call my daughter first, he said the quiet group. Before I call the authorities, before I do anything else, I'm going to call Rebecca and tell her the truth. She deserves to hear it from me, not read about it in the news. Margaret nodded. I'll contact Sophia Castellano, David's daughter. She should know what really happened to father before I make any public statements. Catherine's children. Raymond's voice was quiet but steady. I need to find them, speak to them in person if they'll allow it. They deserve more than a phone call or a letter. Thomas stood, straightening his jacket in a habitual gesture, though his usual aggressive confidence was gone. David's widow, Mary Harrison. I need to find her, tell her everything, give her back what I stole. It won't bring him back, but it's a start. Charles took Vivian's hand, and this time she didn't pull away. We need to talk, he said. Really talk, for the first time in 20 years. Figure out if we can build something real from the rubble of what we had. Vivian squeezed his hand. We do, and it terrifies me. But yes, they stood together and moved toward the train's exit. Jenkins held the door, and one by one they stepped down onto the platform. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pinon pine from the mountains surrounding the city. It smelled like new beginnings, even though Clay knew the path ahead would be anything but easy. He turned back to look at the iron horse one last time, his pride, his rolling monument to success. He'd probably have to sell it, along with everything else. It would become someone else's luxury, someone else's statement. And that was all right. He didn't need it anymore. Didn't need any of the things he'd spent his life accumulating. Clay walked away from the train and into his future, whatever that would be.